All right, welcome everybody to our plenary speaker for our keynote event of this MLL Conference 2023. Our plenary speaker is Dr. Meg Malone, who is the Director of Assessment and Research at the American Council of Teaching of Foreign Languages, or ACTFL. So very relevant to all of our languages that we are teaching. She is also a professor at Georgetown. This is actually a great opportunity for us to be able to get insights into language assessment. Like I said, it touches every part of all the languages that we are majoring in and working on within this department. And I feel like assessment is one of those things that oftentimes isn't fully understood and can be a little intimidating sometimes from the outside looking in. So I'm excited to be able to hear from Dr. Malone. With that said, let's go ahead and turn the time over to Dr. Malone.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Great. The picture behind me is the sky in Mobile, Alabama, where I'm coming in from today. I'm at the Southern Conference on World Language Teaching here in Mobile. I've never been to Alabama before. I'm very excited. So today I'll be talking about language assessment, essential principles, and career paths. I think a lot of times when people talk about assessment, we may not engage everybody fully. So I thought I'd give you a series of stories of how I learned about assessment to relate to different career paths and stages in a person's career. And of course, I want to start by thanking my friend Nathan Carr, who couldn't come to this because I really appreciate how much you all accommodated me. Nathan actually called me on the phone and I picked up, well, I picked up hands-free, don't worry. Well, I was driving home from work because I always take calls from Nathan. And I said, look, I'm supposed to be going to this thing in Mobile. I don't even know if I'm going to be accepted. I don't know when. And he said, don't worry, whatever works. And Hiromi, who did such a nice job of making all the, oh, sorry, that was supposed to be an O, not an A, for making all the arrangements. And then Cal State Fullerton and all of you for coming. It's nice to see you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the basic elements for assessment. If you could just write in the chat if you've taken an assessment course or not, that would be super helpful. Hold on. And then I'm going to talk about how my work in assessment enhanced my career and how you can use that as a message, not just for using principles of assessment in your career, but to take different experiences you have and use them to enhance your career. And I'm going to do that through stories because honestly, I've gone to a lot of conferences lately, and the ones that have really engaged me are where people tell me a story to explain something to me. So I want to describe assessment principles, tell some stories, and relate it to what you're doing. And here's a quote from an article I wrote in 2013, which is about strong and properly implemented assessment that should integrate with teaching. I think one of the issues we have with assessment, which is why we aren't always so popular with our teachers and instructors, is because we very often treat assessment as something very top-down that isn't co-constructed, but instead something that is enforced from, the people in the know, the cool people who are the language testers, rather than working with language instructors. And so one of the things I did was, and so that's a little bit of introduction. And I'm going to talk about positionality and relate it to what you're all doing here at this conference. And what I want you to think about is who we are and how do our background, experience, and identity shape how we see the world. And I think this is incredibly important in language assessment because who you are influences how you assess performances, how you assess culture, how you assess language proficiency. And on the other side of it, who your learners are and how they present themselves to you and how they define themselves can really influence how they approach an assessment and how you approach how you assess them. So a little bit about my statement of positionality. I don't know if you all remember Google 300 or Google 365, which tried to replace Facebook for about 10 minutes back in about 2009. And I joined it and quit, but I can't find it, so I can't delete it. But I defined myself as a mother, a linguist, and a runner. One thing I like to tell people is I'm 20 of 40 grandchildren on the maternal side, which is something that really shaped who I am because I've known when you're one of 40 grandchildren, you know a lot of different people and you don't really take anything for granted. Whereas people who grow up in smaller families have different experiences. I'm a middle-aged, middle-class woman, white woman. I've been in applied linguistics and worked with the ACTFL guidelines for 32 years. And I've studied 5 languages: French, Spanish, Latin, Indonesian, and Sanskrit. So maybe the first 3 would go along with the initial statement of my positionality, but the last 2 often surprise people, particularly Sanskrit. I took it as my second language for my PhD. Yeah, it was super fun, really interesting to learn. And I have a PhD from Georgetown. But I would say, when I assert something about assessment, I have to be really careful to make sure that I'm actually listening to the people around me and not just saying, I'm the expert, I know what I'm doing, but to really stop and say, what's going on with you? So a little bit about my background. I have a BA, a master's, and a PhD in linguistics. So those of you who are undergrads who are majoring in something like linguistics, I want you to tell your families, I just talked to someone who has been employed for 32 consecutive years in linguistics with a BA in linguistics. I am one of the few of my friends from college who has been continuously employed in her field of study since she graduated. And I want you to hold on to that. I tell when I teach undergrads, I tell them that, and they usually kind of put it away. And then they come back from Thanksgiving or spring break and say, oh, my dad was so happy to hear that you have a job. And I sometimes I tell students what kind of car I drive, but since I'm up for a new car in the next 3 years, I won't tell you the age of my car because it might depress you. So some of my experience, when I was a graduate student, I had a federal fellowship. The government paid for me to go to school and gave me a little stipend. So I was allowed to work off campus up to 20 hours a week. And so I became a research intern or research assistant at the Center for Applied Linguistics. Have any of you heard of the Center for Applied Linguistics? It's a great not-for-profit in DC, does great work. And I worked there for 4 years while I was getting my master's, and then I was accepted to the PhD program and did coursework. And I'll talk a little bit more about these. Then I was a research associate for a place called the Evaluation Assistance Center East. Then the coolest job I ever had, everybody stops in their tracks. I was the language testing specialist for Peace Corps for the whole world at headquarters. For 16 years, I was a senior testing associate and later an associate vice president at the Center for Applied Linguistics. Then for 5 years, I had a joint appointment. I was a research professor and the director of a language resource center at Georgetown, while being the director of assessment and research at ACTFL. I now only have one full-time job at ACTFL, but I still teach at Georgetown. Okay. And I am not able to see the chat, so because I'm on a Mac. So let me just, oh, now I can. I don't know what happened. So if you have any questions, I can now see the chat. Okay. So I looked at the website to see what you were doing. I looked at last year's conference and I looked at your presentations, and it said that you're students of literatures, culture, and languages, which says a lot, but it also doesn't go very deep. So I went through and looked at all these amazing presentations you're doing. Undergraduate Latino literature on resilience, justice, and social issues. And I looked at that and thought, how cool. I wish that had been around when I was an undergrad. And then I remembered I took a course on freedom and repression in Latin American literature. And I thought, I wish I'd gone to that. Something on paths to learning Mandarin, like what are the different paths students take to learning a language? Very important for assessment. How does motivation affect language learning? Reading and writing language tests, that looked obviously up my alley. Talks on French culture and Spanish literature and culture, Japanese sociolinguistics, Spanish sociolinguistics, Japanese speech. So you're coming from a lot of different places. So rather than do something really specific, I decided to do something more general and just talk about assessment. But some cross-cutting issues I saw here looking at all of you and your backgrounds, obviously you all have an interest in language and culture. And one of the things I wanted to weave into this was to talk about working decisions for your own career and the tangible and intangibles of career choices. People say things like, oh, I did X and it's changed my life. Well, everything you do can change your life for good or ill, right? So to think about it in terms of the tangible and intangibles, and then some different skills that you pick up in different language testing jobs that I found, and maybe some next steps. So a little bit about ACTFL. I don't know how many of you know about ACTFL, but our vision is an interconnected world where everyone benefits from and values a multilingual and multicultural education. And I thought, this is a vision statement that this group would really appreciate, since you're also interested in multiculturalism and multilingualism. And I just want you to think for a minute, what would the world look like if we all valued a multicultural and multilingual education? And then my second question is, how do you know? And that's where assessment comes in. Assessment can tell you if our learners are multicultural and multilingual, and phases of assessment and evaluation can tell you whether or not those things are valued. All right, so a little more about ACTFL. Some of you may have heard about the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. I'll tell you a little bit more about them because they have shaped my career. We have an annual convention, which is in Chicago this year, which is one of my favorite cities. We're known for the World Readiness Standards for language learning. We're known for our two journals, The Language Educator, which is kind of a magazine/journal, and of course, Foreign Language Annals, which is our flagship journal. And then finally, many of you may have heard of the ACTFL OPI, which is an oral proficiency test with a strong validity argument and with really high reliability, considering it's administered in 60+ languages all over the place. And we run it all from ACTFL, which is very unusual. Most testing organizations manage one language or a couple languages, but we manage, the whole group. ACTFL also has a strategic plan that we've been talking about, and I think this is important for people setting out in the world after a BA or a master's or a PhD to think about the kind of organization you work for and what is involved in their strategic plan. And so our 5 pillars are advocacy and outreach, which I guess this could count as, reaching out to people, letting them know about world languages, and not just language teachers and learners, but other people in society who could benefit from a multilingual world, but perhaps don't know it yet. Another of our pillars is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we try to use that. That is particularly important in assessment because one factor that can keep a learner from showing what they do, what they know or can do in a language, is if a test item is biased against them in some way. And so ensuring that test items are reviewed for bias and sensitivity so that we are including all of our learners in them is particularly important. Research is also important. I'm the director of research, so I guess it's really important to me. And then one of our issues is teacher recruitment and retention. I don't know if you've all heard recently, but maintaining teachers and keeping up with language classes is particularly challenged right now. Okay. So there are what I call the big 5 in assessment: reliability, validity, feasibility, impact, and ethics. And I'm just going to describe each of them. Reliability is exactly what you think about. Is something reliable? Does it produce consistent results? But let's get a little bit more specific there, which means if I give somebody a language test and Mark gives them a language test, and let's say they're both a speaking test, do we yield the same results? That's what we call inter-rater reliability. How can we make sure that 2 teachers rating the same sample come up with the same result? Then we have validity, which is basically, are you testing what you think you're testing? When I was first in this field, actually directly testing speaking was unusual. Speaking was often tested indirectly through like rhyming or multiple choice. I know, don't be horrified. But the idea that you're really testing what you're supposed to be testing. And if you want to learn more about this, you should definitely take Dr. Carr's class. Feasibility is something that I think a lot of people think boils down to money. But it's not just money, it's the resources you have available to conduct a test. And I find very often administrators and others don't understand that resources aren't just about whether or not you have enough funds available, but also, do you have enough time and energy to conduct the kind of assessment that you need to for a program? And this can get really tricky because you can have the best test in the world, but if you don't have the resources, by which I mean money and human resources, and also that you have enough people to conduct it who are eligible to do such a thing, it may not make a difference. And then finally, ethics. So this is my first story. So imagine you're a recent grad pursuing a master's at Georgetown. and you interview for an internship, which was paid, which was a big deal at that time, at the Center for Applied Linguistics. And this young person was very interested in teaching, in literacy, and even in syntax. But at the time, because this young person, who may or may not have been me, because she had an off-campus fellowship, was filing insurance claims paperwork to make money, and decided that she might as well try this thing in testing at the Center for Applied Linguistics, because it paid the same as filing insurance claims paperwork, and it certainly looked more interesting. So what did this person find out? I worked on a team to develop the Japanese speaking test. I reviewed documents for an instrument called the Eric Clearinghouse, which was a government grant that provided free documents on different issues. In the case of the Center for Applied Linguistics, Languages and Linguistics. I also contributed to research and test development grant proposals. In those days, we had shared phones, so I answered the phone. So I got some really wild questions because it would just keep forwarding to somebody until it got to me. And since I was an intern, I spent a lot of time sitting at my desk. And then I also answered a lot of questions about tests. And so the Japanese speaking test, and I want you to just think back to the 90s, it was a tape-mediated test of Japanese speaking. In the 90s, you couldn't do good assessment on computers. In fact, the computer I had at the time just had a green screen. So instead of doing a face-to-face or a telephonic test, we used a test booklet and 2 tape recorders or a language lab to elicit speaking from students. And I know this sounds wild, but actually it has been used in the last 10 years as a test, because sometimes, because of technology available, people still need a tape recorder and a test booklet. And so I don't speak Japanese, and we developed these tasks in consultation with a specialist, and internal and external advisory board meetings. And the idea was that we provided the background on how to develop a test, and they provided the content, and we pushed them like, is this culturally relevant? Is this culturally sensitive? And the whole idea was that the internal and external review boards held us accountable for the language, and we pushed them to make sure that it was, a reliable and valid test. In those days, we held a lot of in-person meetings, and as a graduate student, that was where my dinner came from fairly frequently. And one of the things we really wanted to look at was cultural sensitivity and extensive input from the field. We didn't just want one informant, we wanted multiple informants. So we had a whole committee of people, and sometimes they would get together and we put them in a room and they would argue with each other in Japanese. After a few minutes, we'd stop them and say, okay, what are you arguing about? And they'd tell us. And we'd say, okay, what's the conclusion we need to reach? Because we'd let them discuss, and then we'd say, okay, tell us what the problem is and let's try to discuss it. And then we'd solve one issue, and then they'd go back and they'd argue with each other in Japanese. And then we'd come in and say, what are you discussing? What are we going to fix? And sometimes they would just chat, and then they'd come back and say, you need to do this. Let's do it this way. And sometimes it could be something that looked as small as a word that we were using in the test. And they'd argue about, do you use select or choose for this? What's more accessible to students? And sometimes it would be more big sky, like, is this task culturally appropriate to ask in Japanese? And we tried out with 100 students. Now, I just want to remind you, there was no internet really then. It was very limited. So we had to drive around to different schools or take the bus and try it out in person with students at college and high school. And it was so much fun. It was also really tiring. So what did I learn from this? I learned the ACTFL proficiency guidelines that I'm going to explain to you. I also learned how to process forms, how to fill them out, submit them, and then take the calls from people who said, I haven't been paid. And I'd say things like, oh, I'm so sorry, you put Rockville down and you live in Rockport. I also had to call people I didn't know, which some people call cold calls. Like, you call somebody, they don't know why you're calling, they don't know who you are. Some calls were what I would call warm calls. I'd call and say, I'm Meg Malone. I work with Charlie Stansfield. I'm the Center for Applied Linguistics. Oh, Charlie, how is he? And then I had scary calls where people were like, I don't want to do this work. I don't agree with what you're doing. And then they would explain everything that was wrong with it. And all 3 of these were very helpful to me in my career, because when you do the kind of work I do and you present things to people, you have to be ready for a cold response, which is, I don't know what the heck you're talking about. A warm response, which is, what a great project, and a scary response, which is, let me explain everything that's wrong with the construct you're discussing. I organized a lot of meetings. I had to synthesize feedback. You would think, even though I didn't speak Japanese, I wouldn't have been responsible for that, but I was, because we would have, worksheets that our consultants would fill out, and I would, paste them together so that we could get all the feedback on one item on one piece of paper. I would organize data for tryouts, and I actually was doing some work here, and it has worked for me my entire career. I still put everything on a folder with a description in front of what it is when I have paper products. In fact, I was setting this stuff up for my team that I work with, and I showed up and they were in hysterics because they were like, wow, you never forget, do you? And I also figured out what to do when you get lost on the way to a tryout. There was no GPS then, so I had to drive around with a map and written directions. And one time I showed up super late and I had to apologize, and it was really scary and awful, but it was great because sometimes we screw up. So what did I do in terms of assessment here? The focus here really was on reliability. We developed this speaking test and we wanted to prepare our raters to rate it reliably so that any 2 or 3 or 4 raters, when they got the same sample, would come up with the same response. So we developed forms for them. And this was kind of a new thing. We need to figure out how to set up the form so that the rater would know where to put their rating, how to justify it so that we could find it quickly. And that sounds, I mean, it was really UX without a computer, right? And we'd run these forms by the raters and say, you know, what works for you? And they'd say things like, well, bold the top line, or, and I really feel like I've been working in UX before there was, you know, an X in it, that we were just looking at the user experience and trying to maximize it. But remember, because these were paper forms, they came back to humans, and humans had to figure out how to put them together. We also found algorithms for ratings, like if you get 4 out of 5, you get a score, how does it turn out? And then we would also pick out sample performances for showing raters what different performances were supposed to sound like. And that was all really fun. Any of you, if you've never spent quality time with a tape recorder, one of the things I learned how to do was how to play and fast forward at the same time to run through and get the next sample. And I would say the more things change, the more they stay the same. I do similar things now, I just have different strategies. And then we also had to establish how reliable our raters were. And one of the things we did was come up with sets of samples for our raters to rate to make sure that they were rating accurately. And this gets back to what a lot of you are doing. If you want a multilingual and multicultural world, you want to make sure that your classrooms are truly multilingual and multicultural, and that if you are rating your students, that you're using some kind of a system that is shared. Okay. And these are the ACTFL proficiency guidelines ranging from novice to superior. And you can see how it moves from very basic language up to the top. Now, there are other scales and people use different scales. This is the one I use. And I spend much of my life developing tests on this scale and providing materials to raters and how to rate them. Incidentally, I didn't pick out the colors. If I had, there would be a lot more like purple and red in it, but this is what was available. So when I finished my master's, I got a job as a research associate. And this is for all you TESOL people out there. It was a federally funded center that provided technical assistance on assessment and program evaluation for what were then called bilingual programs. I served 6 states. I conducted presentations. I did research. I went to meetings. I advocated for English learners. I worked on a project to develop assessment guidelines for the TESOL standards. If you know the TESOL standards, I worked on the original ones where they developed standards and said, hey, I think we need to find a way to assess this. Let's find some assessment people to do that. I was like 26. But the most fun thing I did was develop a classroom-based assessment tool. And this got back to inter-rater reliability. It was an instrument for English language assessment in bilingual and ESL classes. And we developed video-based rater preparation materials. So we would go into classes and tape kids, and then I would painstakingly go through the videotape and say, here's 20 samples of Mark. Put all these together, and then we'd rate Mark. And then the same for Daniela, and then the same for Andres. Because there was no inter-rater reliability in classroom-based assessment then. And for the state I was working with, they wouldn't just say, well, you can use this instrument. I needed to show that it was reliable, that the same teachers rating the same students would do the same things, but we couldn't drive 100 teachers around to 100 different classes and have them observe their classes. So we came up with a proxy. I worked with state and local partners, and I developed this 4-part series of like 5 to 6 hour preparation sessions for 30 teachers in 2 parts of the state. And it was really exciting. And what I really learned was how feasible it is to do this, but how long it takes. I had teachers ranging from like kindergarten to 12th grade. And so I needed to show that they could rate at the different levels. One of the things I saw that I was working in a state, but it was very district-based, which meant, hold on, let me make up some fake names. The Rueckert city and Malone city, even though they were in the same state, had different resources. They had different kinds of schools. Rueckert, of course, was very well funded and very well managed. Well, Malone, well, it was a little off there. And so one district might have huge class sizes, one might have small class sizes. One district might have one ESL teacher for all the classes and all the schools, and she might be driving around from school to school to teach her 7 classes a day. One might just have 7 classes in one school. And they were dealing with different attitudes and materials and different student languages. The state I was working in, although Spanish was the majority language, there were 51 other languages that were the students' L1s. I also learned about collaborating with the state and its mechanisms. You're all going to a state school, I'll leave that there. And what I really needed to do was to develop something that was usable in a classroom for teachers with large numbers of students. And we didn't have iPads or computers then. So I developed something that you could have 1 page per student. You could put it on a clipboard and just keep going through. And it was very effective. So what I found with impact, which is what is the influence of a test over time, this instrument is still in use from the 90s. I worked with both ELL and bilingual teachers together. During that time, we started calling ESL teachers English learners or English language learners. I also was working at the beginning of the decline of what was called bilingual programs at that time. I also learned that when you have a video like this to assess students, one of the first things teachers wanted to do was say, hey, let's look to see what Margaret was doing wrong. And I'd be like, nope, we're not assessing the teacher, we're assessing the learner. And I would say, plus, this is kind of stitched together. You don't know what that teacher was really doing because you're just seeing clips of the student. But what I really found was that this rigorous preparation could really increase understanding and reliability among teachers rating samples at different ages, with different language backgrounds and different proficiency levels. So even if you're a kindergarten teacher who was accustomed to only working with Spanish speakers, we still had a lot of shared rating and reliability, even all the way up to high school, with maybe teachers who were working with students from Haiti. And in addition to the technical aspects of it, that we had high inter-rater reliability, we also had increased understanding so these teachers could work together in the state. And instead of like, oh, it's the kindergarten teachers or it's the high school teachers, they really came together as a group. So it was a wonderful thing. And I mean, you could say what I'm proudest of is that the observation instrument is still in use, but what I was really proud about was that I got teachers from across a fairly large state to work together and agree on what we meant by oral proficiency. Okay, so this is the most fun job I ever had, and it's mostly because I'm still in my Peace Corps book club with my 4 best friends from when I worked at Peace Corps. How many of you have heard of the College Board? I'm sorry, ETS? They run something called the TOEFL. ETS ran Peace Corps testing for 30 years, and then Peace Corps decided to bring it in-house, and they hired this really young person to do it. And she had to go in and get all the materials from ETS and start a program internally from the ground up. I had a lot more energy then. And what we were doing was workshops to certify language testers in 60 countries to make sure our trainees were ready to become volunteers. And it was not punitive. There was a lot of support. It was really, if we're going to send these young people off to the middle of nowhere, are they safe? Do they have enough language to survive? And each country or post had established their own scores. So like in Russian, it might be lower than in Spanish, might be higher than in Chinese. And all of the language training was held in country, as was the language testing. And so I organized these interviews in about 60 countries and for certification in about 120 languages in a 4-year period. And that wasn't quite enough work for me. So they also had me work on these program training reports from throughout the world that every single post or country submitted a training report on all aspects of their training. And so I worked with a bunch of colleagues across the agency to design new reports. At that point, I'd been working in the field for 6 years. I felt ancient. I had tons of experience with the ACTFL guidelines. There was no PowerPoint then. Once when I was working at the Evaluation Assistance Center East, I did 17 presentations in a month. there was no PowerPoint, so I had to take these overhead transparencies and mix them up and make new ones and kind of fake it because they were like $100 a box. And I had some skills from watching all those videos in recording things and figuring out how to appeal to a group of people. I also kept track of all the volunteer ratings, and I also managed and distributed physical manuals. Everybody got a physical training manual in one of four languages: English, French, Spanish, or Russian. We had sample cassette tapes for training, because again, even though the CD-ROM was popular then, it wasn't universal. And so one of the things everyone loved about the training was every tester got a free tape recorder, which is a big, I know, I was like, it's 1999. Why do you want a tape recorder? But everybody wanted their little tape recorder. And then I oversaw consultants for about 12 to 20 workshops per year throughout the world. And this is before good cell phones. So sometimes I would have to go into the office in the middle of the night to make calls. Like before everybody did a trip, I would go in and I would call, like, I don't know, Mongolia. And because of my, the person going to do the trip schedule and the post schedule, I would usually split the difference. And sometimes I would just be in the office at 1 o'clock in the morning. Things are better now with cell phones. And what I really learned, in addition to international development, was working across within and different cultures, work styles, time zones, and personalities. Because I was working with so many different countries and languages, one size did not fit all. So sometimes if I was, working with a post, I would go to a colleague like in the health sector, not even the language sector, and be like, hey, I'm working with X country. What do you know about this post? Not just what do you know about the, the language people I'm working with, but what should I know before I start talking to them? And that was super helpful because I had great colleagues, but also because, it's nice to know the inner workings of a place before you go there. I was managing an international testing and rater prep program, which was huge. I developed and analyzed training reports from across the world. And I also had to navigate relationships, not just within Peace Corps, but across not-for-profit and private sectors. I also found out that defending your PhD when 6 months pregnant is not the best idea, but it's a great motivator for finishing your PhD. So anyone out there, I don't recommend it, but it's a great way to finish. In 1999, ACTFL released new guidelines. One of the things that I did while I was at Peace Corps is I became really good friends with the woman who had my job back then at ACTFL. And sometimes on Friday evenings, we'd call each other, put our feet up at 6:30 and have a glass of water. I mean, we literally did, we'd both pour a big glass of water, be like, so how's your week? Because I was dealing with this stuff from an international basis and she was from a national basis. And we learned a lot from each other. And she said, I really want to work together. It was wonderful. And so we collaborated to produce a video of samples, because what I heard a lot in Peace Corps was, these tapes are nice, but I'd love some videos. And so one weekend, we produced 32 interviews in 2 days with 5 interviewers. And that was because ACTFL was releasing these new guidelines. And it meant, because the guidelines were new, we needed new samples to renorm, recalibrate, or reset the expectations for our testers. And it made for much more reliability. And it also made it much more valid because we had much better samples. And there was still no PowerPoint. I just want you to know, in 1999, PowerPoint was really glitchy and people did not show up with like overhead projectors. One of the things I learned, and this changed after 9/11, but when I was running Peace Corps language testing, we administered more oral proficiency tests in more languages than in any US government agency. That's no longer true, but it was at the time. It had this huge positive effect on volunteer language teaching and learning. Volunteers were highly motivated to, pass their test, and their instructors really wanted them to succeed. So the test and the instruction worked together. The instructors knew we're working toward getting our volunteers to this level. The volunteers knew that, so they were really working together. I also managed to get a chapter published on outcomes. I don't know how I did all this. I had a lot more energy then. The other thing I found was that we had these great trainers who did these workshops, and our staff overseas loved it when they came. They thought they were terrific. They were so professional. They really thought that it was the best professional development they'd ever had. And it was very humbling for me to be able to do that. Even when I was like boxing up all these tapes and sending them all over the world and, tracking them down to find out where they got lost on their way to Malawi. But it was worth it because it meant so much to the people who got there. So then I finished my PhD, which was on the ACTFL guidelines. I developed a test based on a survey of 127 students. And then I had this baby and I thought, well, I'm going to find a new career. So I went on to the Center for Applied Linguistics. And how long had I guess I had been working in the field for 10 years at that point. And during that time, I brought in about $8 million, maybe 10, I don't know how much, over 16 years. I managed a team, I developed budgets, I did the work. I developed tests in at least 5 languages, probably more. I did some research studies. I designed more rater preparation materials in 5 more languages. But it all started here, right? With this one scale I was working on that I said, maybe I'll do this for a couple of years until I go back to teaching. And it was all because of this one little opportunity I got. The other people who were interns with me, really none of them have gone into, well, one went into assessment, but of however many, the 25 folks I worked with when I was younger, I was the only one who went into assessment, but it had a huge influence on all of our careers. So what I found is that a lot of teachers, students, and administrators don't like or understand assessment, but we use it all the time. So in 2008, I started in a new field of study, which is called language assessment literacy, which is the idea of what do you understand about assessment and how you talk about it with people. And this is something I'm trying to do more of, which is to discuss assessment in ways that people will understand. And these are my areas of research, which if you're in testing, you know, they're kind of all over the place. This is what I've published on. And my conclusions is really that assessment is the backbone of teaching and learning, or we don't know what the outcomes are, that these principles apply beyond testing and assessment. On a personal level, I've had really great mentors and colleagues, and even when you're not working together, they're still there. And then finally, there's this false divide between English language learners and world language, because it's all language and culture, and working together makes it easier. And that's it. Any questions?
I have a quick question, actually.
Sure.
I was wondering if it would be possible to ask for your contact information in the chat.
Hang on. Let me get back to the chat. I'm on my Mac, which I love, but I am, no joke intended, not quite as proficient because I do more work on my work Dell. So let me find the chat. Back to Zoom. Sure. If you'd like an informational interview, I'm happy to conduct one. I'm actually going to be back at, I was going to say at my office. I'll probably stay home for a few days since I've been around so many people, but I'll be back at work in a couple days.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome, Jenna. Other questions?
So you said early on you had worked on research, you had helped develop the Japanese speaking test, things like that. When you were first getting into this field, what was your motivation and what did you really look to do with all of this?
I mean, why I became a linguistics major?
Part of that, but also like, yeah, I guess just why.
Okay, so I started off life, well, I had like 16 different majors by the end of my first semester of college. I was one of those. And I wanted to major in English, but my favorite professor didn't get tenure. I also found, and I used to say this to my mom back in the 80s and 90s, and she thought I was whatever. I found the English department where I went to school very old fashioned, very white, very male. And when I took things like gender studies or like freedom and repression in Latin American women's literature, I liked that better. So I thought, and it was first semester my sophomore year, and I was taking 2 English classes, Spanish and Intro Latin. And one of my closest friends was a year ahead of me. And her friend one morning at breakfast while I was studying my Latin declension said to me, Meg, why don't you just major in linguistics? Just take yourself out of your misery. You like this language stuff. And one of the reasons I switched fields, honestly, was because it was interdepartmental, and the director of the program, Andrea Levitt, was just an amazing human being, and I wanted to be like her when I grew up. And then later on, I realized that I loved languages and I loved linguistics. And when I started working in testing, I had found an intellectual home. But the truth is, what brought me in is not what kept me. What brought me in was that I could relate to this human being. And I thought, she's a lot smarter than I am, but I bet I could do some of the things she does.
So admiration.
Admiration, and also, she is we're actually still in touch. She's a very down-to-earth person, and she acted like a real person, you know?
Got it.
And then when I was working in testing, which at the time was very male dominated, I loved my bosses. My bosses treated me with great respect and they trusted us to do things, which is something I've carried on. Like I had lunch with a bunch of people I worked with when they were in their 20s and 30s. And they said to me, I can't believe you just let us get on planes and go collect data. And I was like, you're smart. You're strategic. Why would you do any less of a good job than I?
Yeah.
And, you know, thinking back, like I did budgets, like when I walked into Cal, I'd been on the student budgetary committee in college and I was helping work on this proposal and I helped write the budget and the budget justification for like a $300,000 proposal, which was a lot of money in 1990. But I would say I didn't go up to them and say, you should let me do the budget. I kind of let it casually drop that I did these things. They're like, oh, thank heavens. Could you just take a look at it?
So just sticking your neck out for them and trying to keep an eye out for those sorts of things.
Yeah, like I would say finding opportunities where you can be useful rather than opportunities that you think will benefit you is
Yes,
better
of
than
course.
that.
Got
Yeah.
it.
So also there were a lot more snacks in the 80s and you know I needed them more.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks. Other questions?
I was wondering, you worked with Seal of Biliteracy. Can you speak to us a little bit about that? What did you do with them? And, you know, since we have such a multilingual group here, what would be the value of people maybe pursuing that?
So the Seal of Biliteracy is a certification that high school seniors can get on their high school transcript. And it's a seal that shows that you're bilingual in 2 languages. And the reason it's called biliteracy is because that's just what it's called. And you have to show, in most states, you have to show that you can both, oh, Jenna, yay! That you can read and write and speak and listen in 2 languages. In Hawaii, I believe you can have it in 2 languages and one doesn't have to be English if one is Hawaiian, but don't quote me. ACTFL actually is incredibly influential on this. We have a test called the Apple, as well as other tests that can be used to certify for this. And what it can do for kids is amazing. First of all, the washback, like to say, my kid has a seal of biliteracy is wonderful for languages. And so you could say to your parents, oh, I got the seal of biliteracy. When you start college, sometimes schools will let you jump ahead to a higher level of language, which is great because if you've taken, you know, Spanish for 4 years, because I personally just placed myself in a higher Spanish class because I did not want to go to intermediate Spanish with all the people who were just doing it for the language requirement. I wanted to be in a class with people who wanted to learn Spanish because I'm a linguist and everyone here understands what I'm talking about. Everyone else thought I was a little weird. And so one of the areas of research I'm doing right now that I'm hoping to publish on soon is connections between the seal of biliteracy and world language and ESL teachers. Because ESL teachers often don't, I mean, this is no blame. We all have so many things going on. We may not know exactly like what's going on, but I would really like to get the word out about what it means because the seal of biliteracy is really only about 10 years old. And I would say its effects are still emerging. And so finding ways to get kids to teach, not just kids who are enrolled in language, kids who are heritage learners, kids who graduated out of ESL 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years ago, kids who've had other world experiences, former dual language kids. Does that answer your question, Daniel?
Yeah, that does. I was kind of wondering what that also is. He said it's usually done at the end of high school. Is there a way to pursue that after high school or is it only during the high school years?
Right now, it's more like right now because of how it's set up, the seal is set up as a high school graduation kind of thing. I think that we should probably look for, oh, thanks, Jenna, for ways to extend it beyond. But I would say we probably need to look at different ways because the tests right now are set up for, you know, high school kids who are different from adults.
Okay, thank you.
I have a few questions.
Oh, sure. Hi, Haram.
Hi, and I really enjoy your presentation because there are a lot that I can relate that I also have my baby. First one, when I was doing the PhD, at the time I thought I was like feasible, but yeah. Anyway, it's a long time ago. And so you talk about the study abroad. And I know some of my students who's going to go study abroad and also this is one of my research field as well, but there are a lot of, there are like so many variables in terms of assessing students coming back, you know, from study abroad because their living situation and like, there are a lot of things that so I was wondering what kind of assessments that you think it's the more, I don't know, I don't think there's a best, assessment, like each assessment, the testing like these parts and then like pragmatic or like proficiency and stuff. So I was wondering, so I guess that one is they are assessing the intercultural development or something like that. The one that you just posted. So so in terms of assessment, are you assessing the language itself, or are you assessing like pragmatic or social linguistics or behavior that students' openness or something like that? And also maybe if you have some advice to the students who's going to go to study abroad and how they can maximize their learning while they're there.
So the first study I cited is Vanderberg, Page, and Connor Linton, and I was a consultant on this study, and it's a study of, I believe, 1,200 students in 6 languages, studying over a 3-year period, and we administered, that's the SOAPI, we administered a tape-mediated test, mostly because when we were working on it, there wasn't consistent technology available. So, but one consistent technology was making tape recorders available. I kind of was not in favor of it, but it actually worked out fine, right? And they also administered an intercultural study to a sub context of students. And basically what they found was what you would expect. The longer you study abroad, the greater your gains in language proficiency and cross-culture. This second study that I worked on at Cal with my colleagues, Francesca De Silvio and Annie Donovan, and then we shared some of the data with our colleague Wenhao Diao, who's done some other work. We took it to the next level and we looked at 3 languages in 4 countries, yes. Spanish, Chinese, and Russian, to find out not just what the language proficiency gains were, but we also did interventions with host families, because we wanted to know all the students were living with host families. And a lot of people think of host families as like the magic bullet. Oh, just put them in a host family. So we wanted to see what the differences were for students whose host families got some background in how to get them to talk and relate to them, as opposed to those who didn't. It was the most complicated methodology ever, because basically once a host family got the training, you couldn't get data from that family anymore, right? So once somebody lived with Daniel, forget it. So we had to like do it gradually over time. And there wasn't a significant difference in their oral proficiency because obviously they were all living in country, but we did find a difference in both family and student attitudes toward their living situation in most cases, because like we did a pilot study first and we found like some students were so desperate to talk to their families, but their families didn't know how to talk to them. And they'd be like sitting around watching a soccer game. Kids would be like, oh, what's going on the screen? The family would be like, soccer. And so training both, helping the families draw out the students to speak at more length, to get them engaged in real cultural events. So it was very qualitative, but it was also really helpful because the families were like, there was one country we worked with where they were like, we are training all of our families in this from now on. So that's where that came from. So that's what we were looking at. But I would say in the early days of host families, they probably were like a magic bullet because English was spoken a lot less in the 90s across the world. But now you want to make sure that you're not placing a student in a host family that wants their kids to learn English. And I found that with my volunteers when I was working with volunteers at Peace Corps. Like a lot of them did live in host families, and I wanted to make sure that their host families were making them use the language and not just, unless the house is on fire, then you can use any language you want to get everybody safe. And for students studying abroad, I would say, stay away from your friends, stay away from other Americans, stay away from other English speakers, get really uncomfortable. And don't just talk, listen. Like one of the best things to do when you're abroad is to sit in a cafe outside and go like this and just eavesdrop. Go on the metro or the subway or the bus and eavesdrop and try to figure out what's the story. What are these people talking about? What is their story? You know, most linguists are shameless eavesdroppers. And this is a way you can use it for good.
Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions for our speaker? If not, then thank you very much, Meg. We appreciate you coming and talking with us. It's been incredibly valuable for us to be able to kind of get insights into the assessment world and some career avenues that may be of interest for our students to pursue. So thank you very much for taking your time out and speaking with us today.
All right, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon and good luck with the rest of it. And my email is there. So put on the subject line Fullerton so that you don't end up in spam, and that I know that you're not, you know, writing to try to sell me. I get a lot of weird emails often about like, do you want to use our human resources system? No, I don't do human resources. I'm a linguist. So, but it was so nice to see you, and tell Nathan we had a great time and we didn't miss him at all.
Will do. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.